Hi everyone. Today we're going to be looking at Lady Macbeth in Macbeth and thinking about how we can try and elevate our discussions of this character, because I personally feel like she often gets quite a raw deal, and we can try and develop beyond the sort of obvious. One of the things I would say before we even begin is a lot of the ideas and stuff from here come from discussions I've had online with a Twitter account called at GCSE_Macbeth. They're fantastic. It's really worth you having a look at them. They've gone through every bit of the play, all the different scenes. They've also done quite a lot on poetry. There's some really good stuff on there. But I am indebted to them for some of the ideas that I've sort of developed in this presentation. So first off, let's start with the basics. So the key images for Lady Macbeth and the key scenes for her. Obviously, she shows up in Act 1, Scene 5. That's her first scene. She's not actually in the play that much. And we see her in this scene evoking the spirits, which may be somewhat unexpected. We might be expecting a good character as a foil to Macbeth's sort of growing villainy. We then move on in Act 1, Scene 7, where we see her manipulating Macbeth, particularly where she's talking about, people always like to pull up the idea of her rejecting her motherhood by threatening to dash the brains of her child against the wall if I had so sworn to this as you have done. I'm just going to say right up front, I don't buy a word of that, and I don't think we're supposed to. I think what we're supposed to see here is her as the master manipulator, where she is able to evoke an image which is so horrifying and so uncomfortable and so shocking that it sort of forces Macbeth into action. And clearly we agree that they have had children. She says, I've given suck, and he doesn't deny that. They have had children, their children have died. I think what's horrifying is that she is able to use the image of her dead child as a way of manipulating Macbeth into getting what he wants. So I don't think she would have murdered her child, because a couple of scenes later we see her not prepared to kill Duncan because he kind of reminded her of her dad as he slept. But what we do get is that she is prepared to use any weaponry she has in her verbal arsenal to convince Macbeth to do what she wants. So we see her definitely as this master manipulator and saying these horrifying things, but don't necessarily go along and say she was prepared to kill her children, because I don't think we're supposed to believe that. What I think we're supposed to believe is that Macbeth is so stunned she would even suggest that it sort of forces him into action if she's prepared to say those sorts of things. We see her in Act 2, Scene 2 with blood on her hands. These obviously aren't the only appearances of Lady Macbeth, but to my mind they're the sort of big important bits. Where we see obviously the blood on her hands is a big symbol of guilt. We see her shaming Macbeth. My hands were the same colour of yours, yet I would shame to wear a heart so white. And we get that visual symbol of that shared action of both of them have Duncan's blood on their hands. We'd see her in the banquet. Now, obviously, we see her just before that in Act 3, Scene 2 as well, where we find out that Macbeth is now making plans without her. And she hints at Macbeth's problems. And I think what's really interesting is in Act 3, Scene 2, she opens it and she's there going, naught's had, all spent, where our desire is got without content. And the sort of sadness of that, and the sense that the futility of what they've done then really gets shown in Act 3, Scene 4, where they have put everything on the line. She has risked everything and she can't control Macbeth. Everything's going off the rails. She's trying her best, but there's also nothing she can do. There's an inevitability about their downfall, which she seems aware of, but still can't stop. Macbeth, I don't think, is really aware of their inevitable sort of tragic downfall, whereas Lady Macbeth seems to know about it, still tries to do something and can't, and there's something really sort of evocative about that for me. And then obviously we see her in Act 5, Scene 1, in her sleepwalking scene, and again she's talking about the blood on her hands. Will these hands ne'er be clean? And we see her as alone, just as we see her alone in Act 1, Scene 5. Actually, she starts and ends by herself, but in very different positions, and the contrast between those two scenes is really key, because here we see her weak and reduced and pitiable, and seeming of anyone in the play to show something resembling real remorse. What's really key when we're talking about Lady Macbeth is don't only talk about her at the start. So many students only talk about her in Act 1 and 2, and they go, and then she kills herself. Lady Macbeth's arc is fascinating, and you have to show that you understand where she starts, where she ends up, and how she gets there. So even if you were given an extract, say, from the banquet scene with Lady Macbeth in, if the focus is on her, you might want to talk about how she's presented at the beginning and how this is part of her journey towards the end. So always think about it in those bigger, broader pictures. Also really key is you can't really talk about Lady Macbeth without talking about Macbeth's character as well, because their changing characters and characteristics are often demonstrated by their conversation or their relation with each other, because they can let their guard down with each other in a way they can't elsewhere. And so it allows the audience an insight into them in a way we don't get in other ways. So if we're talking about Lady Macbeth, we need to talk about what's her role in the play, sort of what's her function, why has Shakespeare written this character? So firstly, she's a confidant to Macbeth. He can speak to her in a way that he can't speak to anyone else. It emphasises the strength of their relationship, particularly in that Act 1, Scene 5. We get absolutely immediately established that they love and really trust each other. He writes her this letter which tells her these things which he would hide from anyone else. He knows she's not going to be repulsed by them, but instead sort of be accepting and have some ideas. He is prepared to follow her lead. They have this really tight-knit relationship, and that's obviously one of the really sad things of the play, is how that relationship is so ruptured and damaged by what they do, because gradually as the play goes on, we see them together less and less. Part of her job, as far as Shakespeare is concerned, I think, is to make the audience feel uncomfortable. She's not following the rules of society. She's rejecting her femininity and motherhood, which we'll look at in soon. And that's a bit uncomfortable for us. She's seen as a vital woman. She's full of life. She has all these ideas, and that is perhaps a little discomforting when her ideas are all about how to murder the king. She's also a foil for Macbeth's changing character. Because he can drop his guard around her, it allows us to see the impact of all these decisions on Macbeth. And also we can see the diverging ways they go about it. So by the end of the play, you have Macbeth who can't sleep and is trapped in this sort of walking, waking nightmare. And you have Lady Macbeth who seems unable to wake up and is trapped in this endless cycle of her worst memories and experiences. So both of them have quite similar consequences, but the way they play out and the effects they have on the characters is very different, and that's really interesting. So Shakespeare is able to look at two different responses to the same stimulus of that horrific regicide. Another one of her roles is to challenge our own morality and perceptions. She looks like the innocent flower, but is the serpent under it. So we're there forced to consider the way that we get this false face that's hiding what the false heart does know. She looks, that scene where she greets Duncan when we've just seen her plotting his death is really disorientating for the audience and not easily dismissed, because we see that she can manipulate everyone around her, and therefore to an extent we're manipulated by her too. I think she's also there to show what the power of influence can do, and I think it's really key to note it can only go so far. After the murder of Duncan, her influence over Macbeth wanes considerably, and she's left more and more isolated and alone. She doesn't necessarily have that much power herself in this play. Her power comes from her influence over Macbeth, but her influence is only there so long as he permits it to be there. When he decides he doesn't want to listen or doesn't want to involve her, there is nothing she can do about that. And so the loss of that relationship, I think, is quite a massive contributory factor to her own decline. And I personally think part of her role is to perhaps evoke pity. She helps to perpetrate this terrible crime. But Christian tradition would also say that redemption is available to anyone who truly repents. And I think she's the one that probably comes the closest to something regarding repentance. And we're going to talk about that later. But this idea of, I don't know how you can watch Act 5, Scene 1 of her sleepwalking and not feel desperately sorry for her. It is of her own making. She did do it herself. And, you can do the whole, she made her own bed. But even so, you can pity someone without wanting to forgive them or without wanting to excuse them. And I think that's where we are with Lady Macbeth, or it's where I am anyway, where it is so sad to see this woman who began the play commanding the stage, appealing to the spirits, so reduced and so pitiful and so weak. And I think that's a really effective contrast between those two scenes. So before we carry on, I want to talk about the use of the word guilty, and this is something that's been of discussion lately. People often talk about her guilty conscience and things like that, and I think we need to be quite careful about this. So guilty, the first meaning of it is that you are guilty of something. So it's sort of a binary state where you either are or are not guilty of committing a crime. Lady Macbeth is guilty of conspiring to kill Duncan. No, she doesn't kill him. Macbeth is the murderer here. Lady Macbeth doesn't actually kill anyone at any point in this play. She encourages Macbeth to, but she does not wield the knife herself. But she is guilty of colluding, conspiring, planning, organising, encouraging Duncan's death. I'm not sure that we can argue that she feels guilty for a lot of it. What I think she feels is disgust. She would rather not have had to do that in order to get where she is. Macbeth, I certainly think the word guilty we really need to think about with him, but that's for another video. I think she probably feels more guilt than Macbeth by the end, particularly regarding Lady Macduff. That line in her sleepwalking scene where she's saying, the Thane of Fife had a wife, where is she now? That seems to really evoke that sense of remorse or guilt about the death of Macduff's family, which actually she had the least to do with of all of Macbeth's crimes that we see. So he kind of gives her the heads up about Banquo's death. But Macduff's family's death, he organises completely by himself. She only hears about it afterwards. Yet that seems to be the one that really gets through, because of that sense of the innocence and the loss of life and the fact that really they didn't do anything. So you've got some sense of guilt and remorse there. But when she's talking about Duncan's death, and she, who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him, and naught's had all spent where our desires got without content. What she seems to be saying there is, I'm not sure it was worth it, or she's thinking about how repulsive and awful the experience was. She doesn't seem to feel guilt about it, but more revulsion and a wish that it hadn't had to happen, which is, I think, is a different thing. So I would caution you, particularly those of you who are looking for the top grades, to think about what you're doing when you use the word guilty. She is guilty of crimes, but I'm not sure she feels guilty about them. Certainly not for a lot of the play. And the distinction between those two, I think, is quite key. Right, we're going to deal with one of the big issues that we often have in essays, which is where students go, she says, unsex me here, which says she doesn't want to be a woman anymore, she wants to be like a man. We need to be more subtle and more discerning than this. So in this scene, she talks a lot about blood imagery. There's blood imagery all through the play, obviously. So Macbeth is initially associated with these reeking wounds of battle. Lady Macbeth, however, seems to fear blood. She wants to stop up the compunctious visitings of nature and instead asks to make thick my blood. And a lot of critics would tell us this is about her rejecting her femininity in terms of her periods. So the compunctious visitings of nature could easily be her monthly period, and that sense that she can't, at that time, you're more emotional, you're more susceptible to feeling bad and sorry about things. You're saying, I haven't got time for that. I can't fall to this feminine weakness that befalls me once a month. I have to have the strength and resolve that my hormones, though they didn't know about hormones then, would make harder. And she asks to make thick my blood, so that almost like she's unable to menstruate, and is unable to have that physical signifier of her femininity. Because in this world, in this scenario Shakespeare's created, femininity equals weakness. Now, what's also worth noting is she asks for this. She's, come, you spirits, but it doesn't happen. She may speak like one of the witches, but she isn't one. And she asks for this help, but she is the one that is most affected by things. She's the one that we see sleepwalking and disorientated and overwhelmed by everything at the end of the play. So even though she says these quite discomforting things to begin with, where she's rejecting her femininity, what she's rejecting is her weakness. And Shakespeare's using this as a symbol of weakness because in that society they were almost interchangeable, that masculinity is associated with strength and femininity is associated with weakness. And I think this then plays into our expectations, because when Lady Macbeth first appears on the stage, we don't know anything about her yet. And Shakespeare makes some really significant choices. So we've just seen Macbeth watching Malcolm be crowned, appointed the Prince of Cumberland, and that is a step on which I must fall down or else I will leap. We already know Macbeth is feeling ambitious and is thinking about how to help the witch's prophecies become true. We may expect Lady Macbeth to come on stage and be an innocent victim in Macbeth's growing thirst for ambition. We may expect her to be someone who he's going to have to argue with to bring her round or to hide things from. Instead, what we get is a willing, eager accomplice who reads his letter and goes, right, let's kill the king, which is really quite disorientating, and immediately sets up this idea of the Macbeths and their determination to mess with the natural order of things, which obviously is a hugely recurrent theme throughout the play. We get eclipses, we get horses eating each other, all of that. And part of what starts that is Lady Macbeth not going along with her feminine delicacy of avoiding violence and sticking to the right moral path, but in fact rejecting her femininity and instead going, let's kill the king. And it's particularly notable that that's associated with being masculine. So for all the idea that, true men are this, that, and the other, from Lady Macbeth's point of view, being a man means having the strength to do whatever you like, good or bad. But it's also worth really noting that Lady Macbeth's warped view of masculinity, which obviously comes up hugely in the play, she's always having a go at Macbeth, what are you, a man, and all of that, that loses. The version of masculinity that wins is Malcolm, who is an innocent, pure, as yet unknown to woman king at the end, and Macduff, who, when he hears the death of his family, is told, you must dispute it like a man. And his first response is, but I must also feel it like a man. So if you've got a question about ideas about gender or masculinity and femininity or something like that, then Lady Macbeth's version of masculinity is heavily influential in the play, but it's clearly a warped version that the play does not endorse. Shakespeare and the play endorse the version of good, honourable men who feel, who care, who respect life and love other people. But Lady Macbeth here goes kind of against what we might expect and creates this inverted world where she wants to be the type of man who can murder the king. And so immediately we get this sense of inversion of the natural order. And I think that is a much more insightful way of talking about it than just going, she wants to be a man. What she wants is to have that strength of purpose that she perceives in masculinity, and she wants Macbeth to have that. But equally, we see that is a warped, toxic idea of what makes a man, and it is ultimately unsuccessful. So just because a character says it doesn't mean the play endorses it. Okay? Whenever the bad guys say something, they're bad guys, and part of how we know they're bad guys is because they say bad things. So when Shakespeare is putting these words into the mouth of the character who's plotting to kill the king, we're supposed to see that her ideas are not good ideas. So the other thing we see a lot of from students is Lady Macbeth is shocking to a contemporaneous audience. Now, if I were you, I would ban the word shocking in any way. So she was shocking to a contemporaneous audience. Apparently, you know, to hear some students write essays, people were fainting in the Globe going, oh my God, I can't believe this woman. So what I've got here is some of Shakespeare's highlights. Not all of them, but a few. Taming the Shrew, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear. So from around 1592 up to 1606, Macbeth was one of Shakespeare's later plays. He was an established playwright by the time Macbeth came out. He was relatively famous. You know, people would have been interested in the new Shakespeare play. The Globe was a very popular place to go. Okay, so people were familiar with his work. This is what he does with women. So from 1592, we have the Taming of the Shrew, where we get an aggressive female character who is finally tamed by her husband. There are some problems in that one, but it's quite early. We then go to Midsummer Night's Dream, where two women run away from their fathers to pursue the men they love and get married at the end. They win. That's a comedy. We have in Romeo and Juliet, we have a 13-year-old girl who is a fully realised character, far better than she ever gets on film. She's sexual, she knows what she's doing, and she defies her father. We have multiple cases where we've got women dressing up as men in order to prove that the men in their lives are idiots, such as in The Merchant of Venice, As You Like It, Twelfth Night. Much Ado About Nothing, the whole play is about a woman who is the intellectual equal of her love interest and is able to match him wit for wit. Again, another comedy. In Othello, we have a woman who defies her father and runs off with the man that she loves, but that's a tragedy. Sad things happen there. So as you can see, all the way through, Shakespeare is not sticking to what we consider to be the way women were supposed to behave back then, right up to Macbeth and beyond. So Lady Macbeth is not a shocking character to this audience. They are used to seeing women who don't behave as society might want women to behave. So instead of saying Lady Macbeth is shocking to a contemporaneous audience, we could say that Lady Macbeth draws on an established theatrical lineage of women who challenge male expectations. Lady Macbeth is not unique. She's not the first character to turn around and say, and certainly not the first female character to turn around and say, I'm not going to behave how you expect me to. So no one was suddenly going, oh, what is this? The way she does it is fairly new and unique, but the idea of a woman going out of the established expectations of gender lines is not new. Would not have been shocking. It would have been exciting, would have been interesting. We want to see what she's going to do, but it's not revolutionary. And we can see that because this goes right the way back to the start of Christianity. So we should be familiar with this image. This is Adam and Eve. So in this story, which is about the temptation of man, we have a woman who is blamed for a man's decision. So the woman is seduced by evil in the form of the snake. She then encourages Adam to eat the apple. He eats the apple. She doesn't pin him down and force it down his throat. He makes that choice, but it is her fault because she encouraged him to make that choice. So this is a story about the danger of women's influence, about how women cannot be trusted, how women are seductive and temptresses. And this is right at the core of Christian teaching. So therefore, Lady Macbeth is a long way from being a revolutionary, shocking character. She's actually drawing on some of the most well-established female concepts in Christian culture. What we see is in both of these stories, as I say, we have a woman who tempts a man to do something which he knows he shouldn't do but does anyway because he wants to, and she encourages him to give in to that desire. And as a consequence, they leave the relative security and happiness of the place they were to begin with. Remember, when Macbeth's wavering, he's talking about how he's been favoured of late and he should be enjoying this time rather than planning to kill Duncan. Adam and Eve live literally in paradise. But because they can't be satisfied with what they have, they actually end up losing a lot. So I think it is unavoidable to consider Lady Macbeth within the context of the biblical teachings of Adam and Eve and this sense of the female influence and temptation, okay, which we'll talk about now. So thinking about Lady Macbeth, we can think about the relationship. So we see the relationship with Macbeth is actually very strong. So Adam and Eve actually played the blame game quite a lot and sort of have a go at each other about it, whereas these two never really do. They try and help each other. They try to support each other, even when they're not on stage anymore together. We see her covering for him in the banquet, however well she can. We see him, even when his castle is under siege, having a doctor trying to help Lady Macbeth. His manner of doing it may not be there, but he is concerned about her. He wants her to get better. So right through to the end, they don't turn on each other. They are united. We also see her often grouped with the witches, which I think is quite interesting, and I'm not convinced it's quite fair. Partly because they're basically the only female character in the play, barring Lady Macduff. What I think is interesting is they all demonstrate this gender transgression. So as soon as Banquo sees the witches saying, I think you should be women, but your beards forbid me to think so. So he's immediately sort of establishing that they're somewhat androgynous and they have components of both masculinity and femininity, which in a society which likes that to be very divided is discomforting. And then immediately, a couple of scenes later, we have Lady Macbeth rejecting her own femininity. So that obviously sort of ideologically draws her quite close to the witches. And therefore we see why she might be, why you might want to link them together is this idea of, barring Lady Macduff, the apparently female characters in the play are rejecting the natural order of things. So the witches, firstly, witches against natural order, but also their physical appearances seem to suggest that they're not quite men and not quite women. And Lady Macbeth again also rejects her femininity in there. So I think if you're going to connect them together, don't just go, oh well, she calls on the spirits, because the spirits don't listen to her. Okay, but that idea of their connection symbolically and thematically is more interesting. The other interesting relationship, I think, for Lady Macbeth is this idea of the Thane of Fife had a wife, where is she now? So, as I spoke about earlier, to my mind, this is the most convincing evidence of some level of feeling guilt or remorse in the play. There's this sense of almost kinship between them. You know, she was the wife of the Thane of Glamis and Cawdor. Lady Macduff is the Thane of Fife's wife. And so they're in very similar social situations, and one has been killed because she is married to the man she is married to. And that ultimately is what causes Lady Macbeth's death as well. She dies because of her husband. And so there's this real sense of, Lady Macbeth seems to feel that sort of connection and the senselessness and that real loss of innocence in killing Macduff's family for no apparent gain, and almost perhaps that sense of responsibility for what Macbeth has done. She may have set him on that path, and that seems to be the bit that sort of really pushes her over the edge. So if we're going to talk about big ideas, this is the sort of thing we see. You know, women in those times were expected to be meek, submissive, humble and docile. But if that was true, if that was the expectation, then why are there all these stories featuring women who are not meek and submissive and humble and docile and well behaved and stay at home and do cross stitching and things? Actually, it seems more like it's not that they were expected to be, it's that the patriarchal society wanted women to be this. And so there's quite a lot of stories which we could read as almost cautionary tales, because it seems that it's more likely that in the patriarchal Christian society of the Elizabethan and Jacobean era, people appeared to assume that women were naturally awful and needed to be controlled and subjugated for the safety of society. So rather than saying that, oh yes, all women, we just expect women to behave, what we have is a ton of stories that constantly talk about women not behaving. So it seems to suggest actually we want women to behave, but we expect them to be disobedient and not follow the rules that is being set down for them in society. So Christian tradition often frames women as either angelic or entirely fallen. They are either like Mary, absolutely blessed and innocent, or they're like pretty much every other woman in the Bible, and need men to help redeem them and get them back to some state of grace. And that's kind of what we see on stage. So rather than seeing Lady Macbeth as this shocking character who no one could have expected, what we could actually see is Shakespeare's just showing us another cautionary tale. So rather than Lady Macbeth being this monstrous freak of nature who is unthinkable, he presents her as an ambitious woman who is given an opportunity. And that is to some extent a lot scarier, because that is also a lot more common. So if it is true that actually most of society was constantly on the lookout for women to not behave, and I think we can see that even today, then Lady Macbeth's ultimate fate, where she kills herself, you could argue is a warning to women to what would happen if you give in to your unfeminine desires and wants. And it's worth noting that Shakespeare plays both sides of this coin. Okay, so in his tragedies, the women tend to die as a consequence of the choices they have made to some extent or another. In his comedies, they tend to get their own way and live a happy life, happy ever after. So he's not saying it's inevitable, but in this play it is, because Lady Macbeth's desires are monstrous as far as this is concerned. She's killing the king, breaking the great chain of being, subverting the natural order to satisfy her own ambition for her husband. This is a base, selfish desire and therefore must be punished. So I think it's possibly worth thinking about Lady Macbeth not as this monstrous exception, but perhaps more as this is how women can end up if their man goes along with them rather than keeping them in check. So this comes from a really good article, which I would really encourage you to go and read, from the British Library website by Sandra Gilbert, where she says, unsexed by her own will, Lady Macbeth is no longer a conventional lady. Because she has refused to behave as dutifully as her society suggests she should, she seems to become an inhuman creature. So that sense that what she's asking the spirits for, when you're saying, come you spirits and sex me here, makes her somewhat inhuman. A dark parody of femaleness whose blood is too thick and clotted for menstrual fertility, and whose maternal milk is bitter, dangerous and galling. But in unsexing herself, she almost appears to have dehumanized herself and stepped out of nature. That is, out of the natural order of things in which the milk of human kindness nurtures moral feelings. So, really key. Lady Macbeth, right at the start, takes herself out of the natural order willingly, and so we could argue that therefore anything that happens to her afterwards is a consequence of her own actions. However, also worth noting is that she might have wanted this to happen, but we have no proof that it did. And so just asking for something and getting it are two different things. So while she may have wanted to reject the natural order in her expression of her femininity, actually she isn't able to. And I think that's quite an interesting point as well, that Shakespeare's saying that you can't just get rid of the inconvenient bits, your humanity will still sort of come through. So moving on to a few other ideas. We often get Lady Macbeth described as a strong character. So let's have a think about that. Is she a strong character? Well, first things first, she asks for help from the spirits. She doesn't feel she can do this by herself in the way that she is at the moment at the start of the play. She has to ask for help to basically have her humanity affected. So that would suggest perhaps a lack of strength, that she feels she needs that help, that in her current state, she will not be strong enough. And remember what I've been saying all the way through, the spirits don't help her. So she's ultimately proved right there. She is left in her original human feminine shape, and she cannot cope and obviously has that decline. She can't kill Duncan, which I say is I spoke about right at the start. She makes this big show to Macbeth about how she would have murdered her own child if she had promised him she would. And then when she's alone on stage, just talking to us, she tells us that he reminded her of her father as he slept, and so she couldn't kill him. And I think that that's key. When she's on her own, she has no reason to lie. So I take that as the true Lady Macbeth, and therefore I see what she said about her children as rhetorical manipulation, which is not forgivable, but is a lot less than actually murdering her children. But if she's that strong a character, she can't kill him because he reminds her of her dad. That doesn't seem to suggest that she is this overly strong, powerful figure. As soon as he is crowned, so at the start of Act 3, she is distanced by Macbeth. He demands to be left alone. He plots the killing of Banquo without her knowledge, tells her, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, till thou applauds the deed." So this idea of he just thinks he can do it all by himself and she's left out in the cold. So she can't be that strong and powerful because she can't do anything about that. She's utterly powerless. If he doesn't want to listen to her, if he doesn't want her around, she can't do anything about that. She can't keep him under control. He murders Banquo. He murders Macduff's family. He goes right off the deep end during the banquet scene and is ranting and raving about Banquo's ghost. She can't control him. There's nothing she can do about that. Then towards the end, we see her trapped in these nightmares. She's kept looped in her sort of worst memories and keeps reliving them night after night after night, with no sense of how she can be redeemed from that, until finally she's driven to kill herself, which we could see as a strength of character, perhaps. It could be her trying to escape, it could be her being driven to despair, but equally it could be her acknowledging her ultimate damnation, that she deserves to go to hell, she doesn't deserve to live anymore, and therefore accepts that fate. You could make that argument. But overall, when we talk about her as a strong, powerful character, she's only as strong and powerful as she is allowed to be by Macbeth and by the circumstances. And as soon as she's saying things he doesn't want to hear, he doesn't listen to her anymore. So having some subtlety and therefore awareness of the whole play is really key. I would say in Act 1, she is seen as strong because she dominates Macbeth, but he kind of lets her. And then afterwards, that strength and that power really significantly decline. So then we can talk about if she's ultimately, is she responsible for what happens in Macbeth? So my first question is, how much power does she really have over Macbeth? She only talks to him. She is his wife. He can choose to walk away at any point. He can choose to ignore her. Yes, she'd have a go at him. Yes, she'd throw a wobbly. But ultimately, he goes along with it because he wants to. So he is the one who makes the choices. He's the one who murders Duncan. He goes by himself into that chamber to kill Duncan. She doesn't see him immediately beforehand. She's not waiting right outside the door. He makes that choice, and yet Lady Macbeth is always the one who is blamed for it. But it's also worth really noting that he already has these ideas before she appears on the stage. So in Act 1, Scene 4, we see him talking about these, Act 1, Scene 3, he's immediately after the witches, he's talking about having these feelings that, just unseat my hair and make my heart knock against my ribs. So he's immediately sort of fired up with something that scares him and excites him in equal measure. And then immediately he's talking about the Prince of Cumberland being a step on which he must fall down or else leap on his way to the throne before Lady Macbeth comes on stage. So he is already starting to think these things before she shows up. He's not horrified by her suggestion. He's scared of it, you know, if we should fail, he's worried about what will happen. But he doesn't go, I can't believe you'd say that, that's the worst thing in the world, and reject her. He goes along with it. So Macbeth is already thinking these things. He already has these ideas. He's not unwilling to listen. He's not unwilling to go along with her plan. So she has as much power as he allows her to have. Yes, she talks him into it, but he lets her talk him into it. So always consider that dynamic. What's interesting, I think, is that she seems to feel some responsibility for what happens later. So she sets Macbeth on a path. As I say, she had nothing to do with the murder of Macduff's family. She knew nothing about it, at least as far as we see on the stage. And yet, clearly she feels that because she encouraged that first act, there is an element of responsibility at her door because it has created Macbeth, the Macbeth that we see at the end of the play. And so we're left with this idea of whether or not she's a tragic villain. And I think, you know, customarily we'd normally talk about her as being, you know, this villainous character. But I think Shakespeare creates a much more complex character than just that. I think there's a lot more nuance in it, there's a lot more subtlety and a lot more areas of grey. She's not simply a villain. She's not just simply a bad guy. And particularly when we think about the final views of her on stage, the reduction in her and the consequences she's suffering, I think, for me personally, stop her from just being a straightforward villain, because she really suffers as a consequence. Whether or not she feels guilt about it is a different issue, but there is definite suffering and she is definitely punished because of the choices that she has made within the play itself. And therefore, perhaps is calling her just a villain is a little too straightforward.